Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have our econ show. It'll be a little bit shorter because it's pretty close to when we did last week's on Thursday. So, there's not too much to catch up on, but there's enough that we really want to hone in on some key pieces. And when we break it, we're only going to have 4 segments, so just one U.S. segment. But one of the things that we want to talk about is the food security side, especially on a global basis. For those that have been listening to me, I've been saying wheat is the cheapest thing on the board. It doesn't make any sense. And now you have grain prices starting to rally once again. And we want to go through why that's happening right now, what the likelihood of some of this resulting in higher prices for people, and why this is going to be a bigger problem for emerging markets and helping to keep that inflation number stickier than I think a lot of those central banks and, let's be fair, consumers would like. Then we're going to look at the U.S. data. Some of the data got a bit better. Some of it remains a bit lackluster. But realistically, none of it is going to change a rate hike in July. Why that's going to happen, why we see rate hikes continuing at this point in time, at least 1 or 2. Then we want to look at how inflation is still persistent in Europe. It has slowed down. Germany PPI is back, is nearing flat. But again, it's still going to keep. They still have to keep rates going up, and again, that filters back to all of the issues that we've highlighted. And then we've had a lot of commentary from China about stimulus. How things are going to how they're going to try to stimulate the economy. They can't stimulate their way to growth. It's just there's so much debt. We want to look at the debt levels. We want to look at the borrowing because, again, they're bumping up against this wall that they just can't get, or I should say this massive hurdle that they just can't get over by just throwing more money at it. We want to look at some of those key areas. So now when we pivot over, just looking at the Fed forecast for falling inflation, I think this is really good because for those that have been following us, we've been saying that all of these in the forecasts are wrong. We've been saying that from the beginning, and here you can see just how wrong they've been. And it's important to look at the rate of change because you can see everyone keeps saying, oh, it's going to continue going down. Oh, no. I was joking before. Now I actually think it's going to go down. They don't know. And they look at some subsets, but just they ignore all of the other strings attached. Because if you push on one string, other strings will move, other things will adjust. And it's important to look at all of them to understand what those impacts are going to be. Food being one of them. There's so many of these perpetual issues, which is why, and again, this is just picking on the Fed, they've all been wrong. ECB even worse, because this at least they got the rate of change adjusted, where the ECB just keeps making these upside down V's, like, oh no, this is the drop. It's like, no, that's not how this works. And here's why. The sticky to the core. The underlying inflation remains high on both sides of the Atlantic, the OECD, UK, Eurozone, US, G7. None of this is showing you this precipitous drop. They're all showing you, it gets a little bit better, then it gets a little bit worse, and you continue to see this stickiness, this problem when you're looking at the underlying levels. And that's why, the Fed, central banks in general, are going to keep rates higher longer. Why the consumers around the world are going to continue to struggle and at an accelerating rate at this point. And that's why, again, we see issues in terms of what that spending is going to be. Now, when you look at the U.S. being the largest buyer of stuff, and if you look at some of the trajectories of government debt, you get an idea of some of the pain that is coming into the U.S. and just how long can we really continue to issue debt at these levels when you look at the percentage of GDP. Obviously it's a forecast. If the U.S. GDP explodes, this will obviously adjust, but the interest payment is only getting worse. And that's going to be a big problem when you look at the interest that is paid and why we continue to see a bit more slowdown on government spending. You're going to have a lot of these countries are going to have to come to terms with or grip with the problems that we have on not only just the amount of money that's being borrowed, but at what interest. And now this is the other side where people will be like, oh, well, it doesn't matter because, the Fed will reduce rates and allow the government to continue to do this. It's like, well, the Fed can try to move rates in the direction they want, but they've been reactionary to a lot of this. And that was where a lot of people disagreed with me when I was saying that rates were going to go much higher faster, and that was going to, and then it was going to be sticky, because there's still a very large market behind this. And that's why we continue to see a lot of these pressure points. And again, this is just one of them when you consider what is sitting beneath the surface. And the high inflation is spreading in Europe. You know, the share of 33 good groups in the Eurozone consumer price index with a 1-year inflation rate, you know, it's slowed down, but again, it's starting to go sideways. The Rhine River is an important thoroughfare for moving products. You know, we're already 2 weeks into summer and you're at a very low level, which again, it makes it harder to move products. It makes it, this comes back to supply side issues in terms of cost. And while we've started to see some of this narrowing in terms of high inflation, where it's not continuing to go up, but going more sideways, again, it's going sideways. It leads back to some of the issues that we keep talking about when we're looking at inflationary pressures, and food is going to be a very big part of it. Now, one last thing before we get into the food side, hangars have been developed, or have been completed in the Algalega airstrip in the Indian Ocean. You know, the question is, does it belong to India or Mauritius? One of the things that, for those that have been following us, we've been saying that the Indian military has been working closely with both the Japanese and U.S. military to create ways to monitor sub movements through the Malacca Strait to respond to threats in the region. And I can assure you, this is one of them. So again, this is something that even though on the map it might belong to Mauritius, this is an Indian complete installation that will be manned by the U.S. So again, while some people think that we're sleeping on something or getting complacent, I can assure you we're not. And one of the things that is interesting, because people will say, it's like, oh, well, Biden is this or Trump is that. It's like, look, those individuals will change, but the generals underneath never really falter. And that's why you have to separate the two. Congress will go Republican, Democrat, the presidency will go Democrat, Republican. It goes back and forth. It's like, but the military is very consistent. And I think sometimes we don't give enough credibility to that when we're looking and really addressing what is happening within that important front. Now, back to the agriculture side, because this is going to be a very important piece. Now, when you look at agriculture commodities, you can see that we're pushing back higher. And when you look at grain prices today, we have wheat up $34, beans up $19, corn up $22. We're getting another push back to the highs that is rivaling those 22 levels. And now that when you look at the UN Food and Agriculture, which it had come down. Now, I have other charts that I've shown you when you zoom out. Even though the UN food prices have come down, it's still very elevated, and at levels that we saw in 2010, 2011 when we had the Arab Spring. But if you look at just how this tracks, food prices going back up is going, again, commodity prices, futures prices going back up is going to pull that food price in the wrong direction. And again, putting that floor in inflation, putting that pain back to the consumer. So the commodity cycle is, agriculture commodity prices are sharply moving higher, suggesting that food prices are going to continue to move pace. But then when you start looking at, again, global real policy rates are now flat and soon to be positive. And when you look at inflation, you look at food, and then you look at policy, and everyone's like, oh, everything is so tight. It's like, guys, we just went back into positive territory. Like this is something that, everyone is acting like this is such a big issue in terms of this hit on rates. It's like we are very early innings to where we were coming out of the 70s and into the 80s, and what that looked like going through the 80s, 90s into the 2000s. And for those that sit there and say, oh, we can't have innovation, at positive rates, it's like, well, when did the computer take off? Like, when did Microsoft and Amazon come into existence? Where was Apple? And it was all in this pivotal period. So again, that's why we always push back on this stifling of innovation. It's possible, but you need to have cash flow and you need to show that DCF, or at least when you'll get to that payback period. So again, we don't see rates yielding anytime soon. And here's just some I thought some really good points when you start breaking down the data in terms of where food is in the U.S. And the reason why I'm going to focus on the U.S. is because we are a large exporter. And if we can't export it the same way, well, what does that mean for the global market that is continuing to struggle both in China and beyond? Grocery and headline inflation has started to slow down on the grocery side. Headline CPI, when you're looking at the food side, it has come down. But remember, the grocery side is a lagging component. So, you had food, commodity prices come down, you had processing prices come down. So now that is finally starting to come through. But now we have future prices going back up. We have pressure coming back up, which again is going to keep this grocery CPI really impactful on a meaningful level. Because I mean, for anyone that goes to the food store, there is a big issue. There is continuous hits in terms of that value. Then when you look at the contributions to the 3-month annualized grocery inflation, that bottom right, you can see that there is still a meaningful hit from, cereals and bakery goods. When you look at dairy's gotten a bit better, meat's come down a bit, but again, you're comparing it to some of these elevated levels. When you look at the 3-month annualized, you're still getting some small increases. Now, beverages have improved, fruits and vegetables have improved, but the grain side, and then that leads down, if grains are short, then it's more expensive to feed the dairy. Then as the dairy continues to be an issue, then that means that prices for milk and meats go up. And again, this is why we look at all of these different pieces together to look at some of the underlying impacts. Now, when we look at soybean condition and corn conditions, one of the things that we've been talking about is essentially since 2012, we kind of hit the high for final yield. And ever since then, we've just kind of gone sideways. And you see it here in soybean in terms of final yield, that blue line. You see it here in corn. And that's, I think, a very important piece because people are like, oh, that's not true. It's like, well, it is. And because people are like, oh, corn yields continue to go up. This is all man-made. This is manufactured. This is headline noise. It's like, but when you look at the data, there is a problem. And when you look, and then you factor in the reduction of arable land, you look at the falling fish yields, you look at the falling, availability of meat, it compounds. So even if corn yields were going up, but wheat and soybean were going down, it's like there's a replacement factor. We see that with rice, we see that with other things. So there is a bigger and bigger issue. And when you look at the crop indexes, especially if you take 2017, where on the bean side, it's equivalent to, if you will, if not, we're a little bit worse. You can see there was that dip in final yields. You look at corn, something similar. When you look at 2018, when you get that pull down, and it comes down to acreage planted. Corn has a bit more seeds that are available that are drought resistant. So, but it doesn't mean that we're going to get the yields that we're hoping for, because if you look in general, things have been bumping sideways, and we have been pulling down storage, not in the U.S. I'm by no means saying the U.S., but abroad, which is creating this problem when you're looking at food availability and storage. China remains, China becomes the world's largest wheat importer, which is a continuous thing that we're seeing. China is bracing for more extreme weather in the coming days. High temperatures in northern areas could affect corn planting and harm current wheat crops. Heavy rains are likely to hurt rice in key southern growing regions. So when you look at it, it's just they're getting hit from multiple sides, which is one of the reasons why we continue to see them be a large buyer of wheat and other products. The weather in the top importer of wheat, corn, and soybeans come as drought threatens U.S. crops. Heat waves are adjusting different things. In China, heavy rains have already damaged wheat fields, while sweltering heat has stretched power grids. And again, you continue to see how there's a significant problem when you're looking at some of these different movements. We talked about wheat in China. You had rot creep in because they couldn't harvest fast enough. You had grain silos that are rotting out as well. So again, you continue to see some of these pressure points. Now, when we look at some of the statistics that came out, when you look at the U.S. crop conditions, rice slightly better, peanuts right in line. Corn, beans, spring wheat, barley, cotton, oats. All of those have gotten worse, and that's something that we continue to see over this period of time. Which is why when you start looking at grocery inflation, strong and weak share indices, they're converging on each other. So to capture the breadth and intensity of upward and downward pressure on grocery prices, the Council of Economic Advisors constructed measures. First measure, strong share, is the share of grocery components that have 3-month annualized inflation that is more than one standard deviation above historic means. Second, weak share is the share of components that have 3-month annualized inflation that is one standard deviation below their historic means. So while still elevated, the strong share has dropped to 18% from 33%. Meanwhile, the weak share is up slightly to 6.6 versus 4. So again, you're starting to see this come together, and it points to less upward pressure, but it doesn't point to downward pressure. So again, that month-over-month pain, that accumulating piece continues to hit. And given where we are in some of these flows, new crop soybeans and versus corn continuing to move up, U.S. corn crop conditions continuing to worsen. U.S. corn conditions falls to 55% good excellent, below the trade guess of 58 and down from 61% a week ago. This is the week's lowest since 1992 and the lowest for any week in June or July since 2012. Illinois corn to 36%, good to excellent from 48. So again, that's where we continue to see the pressure. And then looking at this in terms of some of the other issues, not only just on the food side, but we turn to Europe. The chart shows declining profitability for European nitrogen output due to the recent increase in natural gas prices. And as you get these prices going up, again, farmers have to buy fertilizer. This just hurts what they're able to do because of the profitability, reducing the amount they put down, impacting yields. And again, those are some of the key pieces that are continuing to hit on a global level. Again, keeping that inflation elevated and keeping people guessing on food and that food security side. So that's what we have for you here. In the next segment, we're going to go deeper into the U.S. and some of the key U.S. factors that are happening right now.